There we go. Good morning, folks, and welcome. I'm Rick Singleton, the Provost of Queen's College, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to another in our continuing education for clergy and pastoral workers series. We do at least one topic a month during the academic semesters. Today, we're delighted to have our presenter is the Reverend Dr. Joanne Mercer, who is no stranger to many of you, but Joanne is first and foremost pastor of the Anglican Parish in Twillingate, but also an adjunct faculty member with us on the Queen's College Faculty of Theology, and well known in the Queen's College community. So Joanne's going to present the session today on the kind of overviews and updates on the marriage canons or marriage canon, and facilitate some discussion on it, and that itself will hopefully help people to kind of think about matters a bit and enter into some discussions. That's really what the church has asked for, is that parishes and dioceses give some considerations to these matters and provide feedback and what have you. So anyway, we asked Joanne if she would draw together. She's done a presentation on this topic with us before, but draw together some developments and review, I guess, the whole issue and so on, so that people have opportunity to stay abreast of what's happening as time moves along from one synod to another. So with that said and done, Joanne, thank you for agreeing to do the presentation, for all that you do for us and with us. And so I'm just going to change over to make you our presenter. And that's taking me. And folks, I want to welcome all who are on this morning and those who were in this room. And we know that many will pick it up as a recording on YouTube. So welcome to you as well, who may be viewing it a bit later. And Joanne, I'll pass it right to you.
Okay, you can see my slide now?
Okay, I'm seeing here on my computer, but I'll have to make adjustments so that it can be seen on the slide for others. But on my computer, I'm seeing your screen, yeah. Not seeing only your PowerPoint slide, though.
Pardon? Just my PowerPoint slide, yep.
No,
that's what I'm looking for.
That's not what I'm seeing on my computer.
What are you seeing on your computer?
I'm seeing just the top of one slide and also the list of the others. I'm not seeing the full screen.
Okay, you see right there, or you have another slide?
Yeah, no, I'm looking at because Joanne is the presenter, so that should be what she would be seeing.
So what about now?
On my, I'll ask others what they're seeing. It might be something to do with my computer here.
No, I see the same thing as you, Dr. Rick.
Okay, yeah.
How about I do this and do this? What do you see? What do you see now?
Same thing.
Okay, yeah. Okay, we see it now.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see just the slide now?
Yeah.
Yeah, just the slide.
Okay then. Oh, the buttons we have to push. So if we're all, have you got that projected, Rick? Are we ready to begin?
Yes, you can move on. Yeah, I have to do an adjustment here to get it on the screen, but that's on the TV, but that's different altogether.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rick, for, I don't know if I want to say kindly inviting me or asking repeatedly over time until I finally said yes for doing this session. It may not be quite as advertised as many things. When you start doing something, what you end up with is slightly different than what you began thinking you were going to do. So what I've decided to do this morning is something a little bit different than I have normatively done when I've talked about revisions to the marriage canon. Normally, I begin with all the various reports that have been written and statements by the church and go through all the history and various kinds of ways in which we've got to where we are today. But I think for most of us, we've heard the discussion around use of scripture. We've heard some of the discussions, read the reports and things like that. So I'm going to assume a certain amount of knowledge. And if you have questions, just interrupt and say you need to explain that. So instead, I'm going to start with talking about some of the things that have been happening lately and sort of try to unpack some of that. And this presentation is really going to look at the revisions to the marriage canon in terms of Anglican polity and how we make decisions, and who gets to make decisions, is some of the changes in our self-understanding that really enable this conversation and have created issues and questions that we need to address. So it's going to be a slightly different presentation than the ones I've done before. So those of you who heard me do this before will go, oh, I figured I have to give you something new, so it won't be exactly the same as what you've heard before. So let's sort of start with what's been happening lately. So what's happened this past month? So this month has been significant because the primates met a few weeks ago, and so we'll start there with what they've said. And so we're going to start looking at this from an international stage and what has been some of the things that have been happening that way. So the primates meeting, so the primates are the national heads of Anglican churches that are in communion with Canterbury, who meet on a regular or semi-regular basis. And so they had their meeting in October of this year, this month, a few weeks ago. And as a part of that meeting, they decided that the consequences that had been presented in 2016 to the Episcopal Church, TEC, would now apply to Scotland. So in 2015, the Episcopal Church changed its marriage canon to include all those who may legally marry in the United States. And in response to that, the primates, when they met in 2016, laid out some consequences for relationship with the Episcopal Church, and I'm going to get to those specific consequences shortly. And so as a part of this primates meeting, it was decided that, that those consequences would now apply to Scotland. And they would apply to the Episcopal Church in Scotland because they changed their marriage canon at their General Synod in 2017. So you might remember that in June of 2016, that the Episcopal Church of Scotland had its first reading of its change marriage canon. That was slightly before our own General Synod. So the General Synod in the Episcopal Church of Scotland meets every year, as opposed to every 3 years like we do. And so they had the first reading of their change to their marriage canon in June of 2016, and they had their second reading of the change of marriage canon in June 2017. And they had the first same-sex marriage happened within the Episcopal Church of Scotland in August of 2017. So when the primates met, that was the first time they met since that General Synod. One of the things that they talked about would be what happened in Scotland, and the primates of Scotland presented his story as to what happened. And so this is from the statement from the House of from the primates meeting. So if you look at their official communique, this is what it states. These are the consequences. This means that for 3 years, members of the Scottish Episcopal Church would no longer represent the communion on ecumenical and interfaith bodies. should not be elected or appointed, should not be appointed or elected to internal standing committees, and that while participating in the internal bodies of the Anglican Communion, they would not take part in decision-making on any issues of doctrine or polity. The Archbishop of Canterbury will take steps within his authority to implement this agreement. So I want you to note a few things here that's important. The Scottish Episcopal Church agreed to these consequences in the same way that the Episcopal Church in the United States agreed to these consequences. There is no mechanism within the primates meeting to legislate consequences. So they have no legislative authority. They are a communal authority. It's authority that comes from them being primates of their church, being the head archbishops of their churches, and the authority that's given to them through that ordination and appointment that they speak as a body. So it is a authority that is given through their position and not through legislature. So that's why it says here that the Archbishop of Canterbury will take steps within his authority to implement this agreement. So he can't necessarily make people do certain things, but he can strongly suggest to them to do so. And in the case of both of these churches, they have themselves committed to do so. So that it is their choice to do this. So this means that while they continue to stand, in these committees and to participate in these committees, they give up voting privileges, and they give up the ability to represent the Anglican community and interfaith and inter-ecumenical bodies. There is no indication in this communique or in the communique from 2016 what will happen at the end of 3 years. So the consequences are for 3 years, and the consequences depend completely on people's accepting and submitting themselves, in both these cases, readily submitting themselves to those consequences. Now, when it says that these internal standing committees, internal bodies, what are they really talking about? So within the Anglican Communion, the primates meetings are one of what is often referred to as the instruments of unity. These are the things that keep us united together as a church. And so these instruments would include the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is usually referred to sort of as the focus of unity. While he does not have necessarily legislative ability, we understand the communion, Anglican communion not enough coffee this morning. The Anglican communion exists and includes those who are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the Archbishop of Canterbury does not recognize the national church or is not in communion with that national church, then that national church is not seen to be a part of the Anglican communion as such. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is a locus of unity, and he is spending more and more time in the last several incarnations of the Archbishop of Canterbury, last several archbishops, spending more and more time traveling the communion and working on issues of unity. The next instrument of unity, and I'm going to put these instruments in historical order, not in order of importance. So the next would be the Lambeth Conference. Now the Lambeth Conference began in 1867, and it is the meeting of all bishops all diocesan bishops. Sometimes suffragan bishops are there, sometimes not, throughout the whole communion. And this meeting began in 1867 in response to requests from bishops, particularly from bishops from Canada, who wanted some clarity. And it really was in response to questions around biblical interpretation. And so there were some disagreements amongst the bishops and some about how one approaches biblical interpretations and understandings. And so they felt the need to gather together as bishops to talk about what they teach and to talk about the unity of the church. And so right from the beginning, we'll notice that instruments of unity are often created in response to very particular situations. The next instrument of unity is called the Anglican Consultative Council, which was created at the Lambeth Conference of 1968 and first met in 1971. Now, before the Anglican Consultative Council existed, there were various consultative bodies that had been created that would really continue to meet between Lambeth conferences, because Lambeth conferences, I should have stated, meet normatively every 10 years, not always every 10 years, as it has not met for a few years now. But between the meetings of the Lambeth Conference, there was felt to be a need to have some kind of continuity. So at various points within our history, there have been consultative bodies, particularly from the 20s and 30s on. Now, these consultative bodies were really bodies of bishops. Various bishops were appointed, most often because of the transportation issues early on, that these people were actually residing in England or near England. So people from other parts of the communion would have people in England who would represent them at these bodies. Then the last sort of consultative body also included people from missionary societies. So it started to include some people who were not all bishops. But up until 1960s, consultative bodies that met between Lambeth conferences were primarily Episcopal. Now, I'm telling you this because I think that this is a very important thing to note and very important thing to understand when we're talking about some of the major changes in polity of the Anglican Communion. So when the Anglican Consultative Council was created at Lambeth 1968, it would have been the first time a body, international Anglican body, a consultative body to the Lambeth Conference would have been created that included clergy and lay people. And in 1968, would have also meant it was the first time such a body was created that would have included the voices of women. And you have to understand that in 1968, there was a lot of things happening in the world. 1968 is the sort of the year of the Prague uprising, the student uprising, and there was a lot of movement internationally within global politics to hear the voice of the people, and insistence that the voice of the people mattered. So in some ways, Lambeth 1968 is quite different than the other Lambeth councils before it, in that it did attempt to give voice to the people in creating this Anglican Consultative Council. Was a very radical change in our approach, because up until then, the idea was that those who could make decisions for the communion, who could make direction decisions around doctrine or polity, needed to be bishops, because bishops by nature of their calling and ordination were given that authority right from biblical times. So the creating of an Anglican Consultative Council was a radical change, and cannot be understated, I don't think, how radical that was. And actually, some folks thought that when the Anglican Consultative Council was formed, that there would no longer be a Lambeth Conference, that this would be the body. That, of course, was not the case, but it was considered to be so important at its time. And one should note that at its first meeting in 1971, one of the things that happened at that meeting was that the Anglican Consultative Council decided that that if a bishop followed proper procedure and canon within their own country and diocese, that they would recognize their right to ordain a woman. So this was a very radical move, and I would suggest to you that some of the creation of that fourth instrument of unity was in reaction to the Anglican Consultative Council and a desire to return to the consultative bodies that existed before the Anglican Consultative Council in 1968, that consisted primarily of bishops, of national bishops who were able to meet together. So the primates meeting actually came out of the Lambeth Conference in 1978, and that desire that that Coggan, Archbishop Coggan at the time, expressed that people should, that primates of the churches should gather together for counsel and prayer, and so that they might hear the voices of the national church. Of the national churches. Now, again, you might sort of be thinking, what's this got to do with the topic at hand? But I do think it's significantly important for us to understand who gets to make decisions, because as we continue our conversations here in Canada, I do believe that what has happened, the consequences that have been applied to the Episcopal Church and the consequences that have now been applied to the Scottish Episcopal Church will be brought up as a part of that conversation. And we need to have some understanding of how we got to that kind of place within our international bodies. So I've given you a little bit of history, and I would want to suggest to you that this sort of notion of instruments of unity is actually a very contemporary one. It's, so 1978 is the last so-called instruments of unity, and it's really only been in this past, generation that we've been considering these things, this notion of there being instruments of unity within the Anglican Communion. So I don't want you to sort of think of those things as a given or something that has a long history, other than the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury. These are all relatively, new creations of the communion. And they have all been created really as the communion struggles to understand itself and understand how it exercises authority. Because up until these times, of course, it was a colonial church attached to the Church of England. So as it comes to re-understand itself, the questions of authority and who gets to make decisions are primary in order for people to have relationships. So besides the Archbishop of Canterbury, the other three instruments, as I've discussed, seem to have been created in response to conflict. So in response to questions, decisions that need to be made, then the communion creates bodies that can meet together and to discuss these in a hope to be able to keep the communion together and to maintain relationship in spite of difference. And the creation of the Anglican Church of Canada, the Anglican Consultative Council was, as I've always stated, a significant move in that it included clerics and lay people, and at the time was the only place for the voice of women. So it was a very significant move in 1968. And it really, these bodies really bring home the importance of the episcopacy in our polity and the whole rise of the voice of the laity. So we see now that for the most part, our lay people have an expectation of a sense authority themselves and a sense of voice that was really foreign to the church before this time, before the Anglican Consultative Council. And I think that that's important because we make kind of assumptions about who gets to speak and who has authority, and we assume things that are really very recent changes within our structures and our polity. And it has always been, the Anglican Church, as most churches, we're not a democracy, and there is a very particular role for bishops, in a very particular role around maintaining unity and doctrine and teaching. That is their very particular role and not the role of any other person within our church. So this was a very interesting quote I found from Michael Pierce, who was former Primate of Canada, when he talked about the creation of the primates meetings. So he said, basically oops, sorry, something just happened. I have just a second. Oh, there we go. Basically, in 1978, what was happening in 1978 was to try to put the brakes on the Anglican Consultative Council, who clearly, in the minds of many people, were galloping towards ruin, Pierce recalled. And they thought that the primates would be able to rein in the horses. And one of the things you have to be mindful of as well is that these are people, just like all of us. And there's some indication, if you look at documents of the time, that there was conflict, can you imagine, between some of the lay people and some of the primates throughout the world. And so primates didn't necessarily sit on the Anglican Consultative Council. There was representatives from the national church, one lay, one clergy, one bishop. So that may not be the primate. And so these people who were meeting at the Anglican Consultative Council who were able to make decisions that may indeed not reflect the desire of the primate. And maybe some of those people were actually in conflict type of relationships with their primate. And so those were some of the realities on the ground when the primates meeting was originally created. So if you've I don't know what just happened there. Sometimes my computer doesn't like me. So in response to this very last primates meeting, I don't know if you've had a chance to read it or not yet, but Archbishop Fred Hiltz, our primate, released his reflections on this meeting, which are very good. And this is a quote from him. And he says, "I sometimes wonder if the meeting of the primates has in fact moved definitively beyond what Archbishop Donald Coggan intended it to be, a gathering for leisurely thought, prayer, and deep consultation, an occasion for the primates to act as channels through which the voice of the member churches are heard and the real interchange of heart can take place." So even our primate is really wondering if in sort of attempting to enforce consequences, if this is really what the primates meetings were about, were created for, and if we need to relook at that. What's interesting as well in this last primates meeting, and I haven't quite wrapped my head around it yet, is that they have now created regional primates meetings as well. So certain issues and concerns will be referred to regional primates meetings for discussion rather than automatically referred to the Archbishop of Canterbury or to the General Secretary. So that's, and I know again what power those bodies will have is questionable, because they only really have the power of recommendation. Are we all right? Have I lost anybody? We're good?
Yeah, I think everything's good. Very clear audio and video. And
all right.
Not sure if anyone has questions or comments to ask to you.
So really what I guess I'm saying is that in this last primates meeting, they've made some recommendations for consequences as they did the last one. This is significant for us because I think, you know, when the National Church meets to consider the second reading of the canon, then this will come up, that these consequences will apply. What's really interesting, I think, as well, is for us to recognize that when the Church of Scotland voted, they were well aware of what the consequences were. And if I read the notes from the meetings of the primates correctly, then I believe that the primates of Scotland you know, came to that meeting already accepting that these consequences were in place and that they would apply to their national church. So that's very important for us to recognize. And I think for those of you who read St. Michael's report, which was written several years ago, in it presented some questions. And I think that the outcome from this primates meeting really reflect these questions, and they're still very important questions for us. That is it theologically and doctrinally responsible for one member church of the communion to approve a course of action that it has reason to believe may be destructive to the unity of the communion? So is it theologically responsible for the Episcopal Church or for the Scottish Episcopal Church to make a decision when it knows that there are going to be consequences and that it may affect the unity of the church? So obviously the Scottish Episcopal Church, having already known what some of the consequences were, felt that it was their responsibility to move ahead. And the other flip side of this question then is it theologically or doctrinally responsible to accept unity as a value which transcends all others, and therefore for a member church of the communion to refrain from making a decision when it believes it has an urgent gospel mandate to proceed? So these are the things that are going to really weigh heavily as we move forward, because it is going to be very clear what some of the consequences will be for us as a national church if we choose to move forward, if we choose to pass the revisions of the canon at this second meeting of our General Synod. And so one needs to sort of really give some thought to what those consequences are in the real day-to-day life of our church, and what the consequences are if we don't. If we choose unity as the overriding factors, there will be other consequences. There may not be a body to tell us what exactly they are, but certainly there are consequences for us in choosing unity as the value. But I think that this really points out the importance of this dichotomy in our decision making. All right, so I want to move now from the international stage and what some of the things have happened there back to our national situation. So I spent some time describing to you what some of the structures were internationally and how they played, and so who gets to make decisions and who gets to choose consequences, and whether those consequences are enforceable or not. So this is just a very general layout of how our church organization works in the Anglican Church of Canada. And so that we are members of congregations. Some parishes have only one congregation. Some parishes have several congregations. Parishes are part of deaneries. Deaneries form dioceses. Dioceses form provinces, and provinces form a general synod. So this is something hopefully that you are aware of. But what is important for us to recognize when we look at our church organization is that different bodies within the church have authority over different decision making. And this is very important when considering the change of marriage canon. So there's certain things that that we can decide as a congregation that we don't need to take to the diocese. So like if we wanted to paint our hall a different color or something like that, these are not decisions, you know, or if we want to have a special service for Canada Day or something like that, these are not decisions that need to be made at a diocesan or provincial level. There's certain things that we can do. There's certain other things that a diocese has to decide. We're going to change our policies, you know, our constitution, our canons. Those are things that a diocese can do. Certain things only a province can do. And when it comes to matters of doctrine, there are certain things that only a general synod can do. And I'm going to point out some of those things as we go. So knowing our structure is an important thing in terms of knowing who has authority to make what decisions. So if we're talking about what's happened, oh my heavens, I did it again. I have no idea what's happening, why it does that. Let's see. Oh, here we go. If I touch something, I apologize for that. So it's important for us to know what we're talking about, what the resolution is. So just in case you have not read the resolution, I'm going to put that resolution up here before you. And so this is the resolution that was brought to General Synod. The Canon 21 on marriage in the church now would apply to all persons who are duly qualified by civil law to enter into marriage. Number 2 just makes the grammatical changes in the canon that would take out the specific references to man and woman and husband and wife. And section 3 of that canon, that resolution, sorry, would change that a minister may only solemnize a marriage between persons of the same sex if authorized by the diocesan bishop. So it enables that the diocesan bishop will have authority in making decisions around this, so that even if the national church were to pass this resolution, it is still up to the diocesan bishop who may who may perform such marriages and where they may be performed, and that the resolution come in effect on the first day of January after being passed by General Synod. The other regulations around Canon 21, around the marriage canon, remain the same. So already within the marriage canon, I should state that clergy have the right to refuse to marry people. So if someone comes to a clergy to be married and the clergy has reason to think that this is not a marriage that they can perform. I haven't heard many cases. I know some people, when somebody's had a long history of failed marriages or of abusive situations, sometimes a clergy have denied somebody, have refused to marry somebody, I should say. So that is already in place. So just to reiterate that, that's why that's not in the revisions to the canon, because that doesn't need to be revised. So that's the changes to revision. Basically, that we can marry, we will be able to marry anyone who's civilly able to be married. So as long as you meet government regulations, we will be able to marry you, and that same-sex marriage would only happen if authorized by the diocesan bishop. So those are the sort of big parts of that. So what's happened since, so that made it through its first reading, and as I would think all of you know, that was a very dramatic kind of event because of the computer system that they used, in errors in tabulation, that by one vote changed how the outcome, changed the outcome of that. The passing of that motion. So it is a very divisive kind of motion. Immediately when the motion was thought to have been defeated, several bishops came out and said, well, we're going to go ahead anyway. This caused quite a bit of anger and frustration on people. Then, of course, the next day they come back and find out that the vote had actually passed. So some of those bishops sort of said, we're still going to go ahead, and some of them said that they would now wait. So what has actually happened? So as I said, some immediately said that they would go ahead with the process towards same-sex marriage. So as of right now, as far as my research can tell, 3 dioceses have already, obviously not done grammatical check, but performed, not preformed, performed same-sex marriages. And those would be the dioceses of Ottawa, Niagara, and Toronto. So already those 3 dioceses have gone through the process of licensing people to do so and have performed, not preformed, marriages. 2 other dioceses, the Diocese of Montreal and the Diocese of British Columbia, have stated that they will go forward. So you have 3 dioceses that have already gone forward, 2 dioceses who said that they will go forward. You have some bishops who have stated that they will wait until 2019 to see what happens at the General Synod and will sort of stay in a holding position until the decision has been made. Some bishops have objected to the whole process. So some bishops have said that this whole thing, the whole way we've approached it, the whole way we've discussed it, the whole thing is wrong. You know, the whole process needs to be thrown out and need to start again. Some bishops have committed to engaging in dialogue within their own diocese. So in my particular diocese, in the Diocese of Central Newfoundland, we're in the process of creating resources for folk to engage in the process, and our bishop has committed that before they return in 2019, that they will be able to say that we have made an effort to engage in dialogue, which is what we've been asked to do. And while all this is happening, you can imagine that this has caused a lot of dissension with the House of Bishops. The House of Bishops are meeting next week, I think. But the House of Bishops continues to struggle with questions of unity and relationship. So there are a lot of, just like there are a lot of broken relationships within the primates meeting, I would venture to say, I'm not a member of the House of Bishops, but there is a lot of pain and struggle within the House of Bishops of our Anglican Church of Canada, because people feel betrayed by one another, by the things that they've said, and by the actions. You know, when some people have gone ahead and gone ahead with same-sex marriage without waiting for the whole process to be finished, other bishops feel that you know, that their trust has been betrayed. Bishops who have been, you know, telling their synods to wait and wait and wait for a very long period of time also feel frustrated and betrayed that their church is unable to support them in doing what they feel called by the gospel to do. So there's a lot of difficulty and struggle within that. And one of the questions I sometimes get, and actually I think I got it just a week or so ago from somebody who asked me, but I don't understand, like if we're in the middle of this process and we're going to vote on it again in 2019, how can some bishops just go ahead and allow a same-sex marriage if that's not the canon has not been altered? So I want to address that question. So how can they make these decisions? How can they go ahead? There's a couple things that they're considering. One is that some have relied on the opinion of the Chancellor of our national church, who stated that the canon, as it is without any alteration, does not contain either a definition of marriage or a specific doesn't prohibit solemnizing same-sex marriage. So there is nothing in our canon that would prohibit folks from solemnizing same-sex marriage according to the chancellor. Now, I should state that while that sort of became quite explosive when he suggested that, you know, before the beginning of General Synod, he's not the first one who has over the years suggested that there is nothing within the canon itself that would prohibit us moving forward. There's no list of exclusion. Of course, there isn't, because when the canon was created, that wasn't even a consideration. So why would you have put something in to prohibit it? So you have, it's correct that the canon, and it doesn't have a definition that says that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. So that's what some people said. Well, Chancellor says that actually by going ahead with this, we're not breaching the canon as it is, so we may go ahead. So that's what some of the bishops, that's some of the argument of some of the bishops. The other thing that the Chancellor stated, and other bishops have used, is that Anglican conventions allow bishops to authorize liturgies to respond to pastoral needs within their diocese in the absence of any actions by this General Synod to address these realities. So when I went back, when you remember that slide I had of the structure of the Anglican Church of Canada, that structure allows that dioceses and provinces can create pastoral liturgies that meet the needs of the people when General Synod doesn't have such a liturgy to do so. But it's very specific as to how and when they can do this. So here are some of the things that they need to, the underlying polity of the Anglican Church of Canada, some of the things that allow them to say that they have the authority to do that will be stated in the Declaration of Principles. So in the Declaration of Principles of the Anglican Church of Canada, it states that subject to provisions in Section 7, that the General Synod have authority and jurisdiction in all matters affecting in any way the general interest and well-being of the whole Church, and in particular, the definition of the doctrines of the Church in harmony with the solemn declaration adopted by this General Synod. So if you remember that part of the St. Michael report was the matter of the question of whether or not same-sex, well, that was blessing same-sex marriages at the time, was a matter of doctrine. Now, why that question was so important was because of this. Because if it is a matter of doctrine, then only the General Synod can make a change. And so what it was, what the opinion was that it was a doctrine, but it was not considered core doctrine. That means that it was not that one could have a difference of opinion about same-sex marriage or same-sex blessings and still conform to the creeds and the documents of the undivided Church. So this is important. So if we sort of say, if a bishop were to argue that this is not a matter of core doctrine, so it does not necessarily then have to be decided solely by the synod, then that would allow me to look at Section 7, which says that provincial synods shall have authority and jurisdiction in all matters affecting the general interest and well-being of the Church within their respective jurisdictions in the following matters. And one of those is the authorization of special forms of prayers, services, and ceremonies for use within the province for which no provision has been made under the authority of the General Synod or the House of Bishops of the Anglican Church of Canada. So this would be the argument. One, that it's not breaking the marriage canon, and two, that within our Declaration of Principles, it allows for bishops to create services and prayers and ceremonies that have not been made available under General Synod or the House of Bishops, which are not major changes in doctrine. Again, other people would not agree with that assessment, but that is the argument. So here are some questions for us to consider as we go forward. And one of those is, how do we make decisions as a church? So who gets to make these decisions around changing our marriage canon? I mean, are these things that dioceses can decide? Are these things that the national church can decide? Are these things that can only be decided as an international body? So there are various opinions. So there are people who think that this is such a change in practice and in teaching that it is not something that even a national church can decide. Others think it is a responsive to a pastoral needs that certain that are exist, in certain dioceses, and so that people have the right within that diocese to create liturgies that address those pastoral needs. So there are, a lot of different opinions about that. Who gets a say in the decision making? Is it only bishops who get to have a say in this decision making? Do laity and clergy have a role? One of the things about our church is that even if laity and clergy you have an opinion, that and they express that opinion to the bishops are not obligated to conform to that opinion. So in many dioceses across our country, synods have already voted that they would like to go ahead with the marriage of persons of the same gender, or with all those who may legally marry. But the bishops have said no. They've said no, that they will not go ahead until that the process is complete within our national church. Then there's the question of whose voices are being heard. One of the things out of both Lambeth Conference, our House of Bishops, and our General Synod has been a decided effort to make sure that we are hearing the many voices within our church. So one of the calls, I think, at the last General Synod was, decisions shouldn't be made about us without us. And so there is that concern of hearing the voices. And so if decisions are being made primarily at the level of bishops or primates, then are all these voices able to be heard at that level? One of the calls for these decisions to be made at the level of the episcopacy or the primacies is that these structures are biblical, that within the biblical narrative of the early church, that it was, the episcopa that made these decisions. And then, so is in keeping those structures, is that a biblical or is that outdated? Do we live, does our culture now mandate that we change our structures to enable the equal say in decision making by the presbyters, by the priests, and by the lay bodies? So those are very important questions. Then when we look at our international structures, one of the questions would be, what authority do they have? Are they authoritative? Do they have by virtue of their history and standing, by virtue of who they are, have the authority to make decisions and to dictate to other people, other members of our church, how to live? Are they really reactionary? I mean, are they created in defense of a system that's under threat, or a thought or belief that's under threat? One of the difficult things for us as members of the Anglican Church, is that we have to unpacked as well, which I really didn't touch on this morning, is the colonial history of our church. So, our international structures are really still a vestige of that kind of authority and that kind of understanding. And while they now represent people from all around the communion, and people, is no longer the voice of white males. Is the structure itself still inherently colonial in its approach and its maintenance of structure? Or are we really moving towards the biblical understanding of koinonia, where we are a body together in relationship through Christ, and listening to one another? And are we held together not by legislation or authority, but by the holy call to remain in relationship even as we differ? And one of the great things, about, the primates meeting this past month is their ability to stay together and to meet together, to pray together, to study together, and to work on things together, even though that they have expressed an incredible diversity of opinion. So does unity really mean that we all agree on the same things, or is unity really inherent in us being members of the body of Christ, and our differences really enhance our unity rather than being a threat to our unity? So those are some things for us, I think, to consider, as we move forward. So in our parishes, how can we engage in this issue? I've taken a very different approach to engaging in this issue this morning than I normatively do. But I want to tell you that there's lots of different ways. In each of our dioceses has resources available, and the National Church also has a list of study materials available, so that you can engage with this issue on parish levels or on any level you want. So some of these resources provide biblical approaches, Bible studies, engage in very particular passages that have to deal with human sexuality. So one of the ways that we can go forward is to sit together and read those passages together, and to discuss them. And these are things have been happening in the church since really the 1960s. And so to suggest that we haven't done so, it would be would not be true, but maybe we haven't done so in our own memory. And because it was done a long time ago does not mean it wouldn't be a benefit to us to continue to do that. There are some amazing resources available as well for us to meet together to discuss questions of human sexuality. Questions of gender right now within our larger communities are very prevalent, and there is a real questioning of how we understand gender and how we express our sexuality, and how much of that is cultural and biological, all kinds of very interesting questions. And then how does that impact our biblical understanding of who we are as people created in the image of God, and members of the body of Christ. So there's some really interesting approaches one can take there. You can unpack any of the reports and statements made by the church. There's a whole list of statements made by the House of Bishops. There are international reports. There are national reports. The last one, this Holy Estate provides some very good questions and very good background information if you should want to take that approach, in that it is very valuable to sit down with a group of people to do that. And then in the reports such as the St. Mike report, takes a very theological approach to engaging these issues and asks how looking at these questions impacts various aspects of our theology. And so that's another approach that you can do. Or, as I did this morning, we can look at our church history and polity and sort of see how we make decisions and ask some very important questions in terms of who we are and how we're structured to be. I think for me, the important thing in all of this is that we engage in respectful and meaningful conversation, that listens deeply to the opinion of others. I think so often we are already convinced of how we feel about these issues, and so rather than listening to how our brothers and sisters of faith have come to very different understandings than we have, and to be respectful of how they've done that, and to recognize that those are statements of faith, we listen rather just to figure out where we can punch holes in their argument and prove ourselves correct. So that's what I have for you this morning. I'd gladly take on any questions and fill in any background that you may have, that you may want.
Well, this has been very interesting and a great overview and review and interesting coverage of some of the developments and changes and implementations that have come about over the last few months since the General Synod in 2016. So I'm going to just throw it out now to ask if there's any questions or comments. You can ask them yourselves, folks. Make sure to unmute yourselves, or you can type them in on the chat option, and I'll pass along the questions to Joanne for you. But in the meantime, I'm sure you're all able to do it yourselves. But here in this room, we have 7 people gathered, so there might be someone here who wants to ask a question or make a comment right now. And those are online can kind of prepare yourselves as well. Don't be shy. Lots to discuss and chat about.
It's hard to give a presentation when I can't see confused faces in front of me.
Okay.
Joanne, if I could ask you to clarify.
I'm just going to ask people also to
Absolutely.
identify themselves. Yes, go ahead.
I was just about to say, it's Jonathan Rowe here on site at Queen's College.
Yep.
You spoke about when talking about how do dioceses make decisions moving forward without General Synod, and you talked about Section 7 giving authority to authorize rights and pastoral procedures. Can you clarify again for me? That's Section 7 of. I know you said it was a Declaration of Principles.
Declaration of Principles, yeah.
Declaration of Principles. So. I mean, it seems to me that was kind of news to me at the time when during the evening of General Synod in 2016, when I think it was the Diocese of Ottawa first jumped out and said we're going forward with this, and I had friends and colleagues in the Diocese of Ottawa, so I saw that first, and it struck me at the time that if again, like you said, if bishops want to set their own authorized rights within their own dioceses, surely they have the authority to do that. But apparently, if Section 7 gives the authority to provincial synods to do that, it sounds like they're actually. It's not that they're jumping out ahead of General Synod, but they're jumping ahead of provincial synods.
Yeah, and I think you're right there, Jonathan, that is my reading of the canon. But I've not known. In my experience, my 27 whatever years, that usually those local liturgies are done by the provinces. Now, I don't know if, and I'm not a canon lawyer, so I'm not sure if the canons of various provinces enable that. But I'd have to look at that, because there must be a mechanism, because it is true.
Yep. And
certainly when, when some of these conversations began, the Diocese of New Westminster in its reports, and that's usually going back 15 years or more, I would say, their strong argument that was around blessing of same-gendered relationships, their strong argument was that this was a pastoral situation, and so the bishop had the right to create a pastoral liturgy, and that was how they framed it. So that conversation certainly has been a part of the conversation for a long time. But once we moved from blessing of same-sex unions to marriage, there is a real question of whether or not bishops have the authority to change the liturgy of marriage, because that's a sacrament, and marriage is normatively guided by the national church. Now, you can put all kinds of wrinkles in this, because because now, we tend to enable people to use sacramental liturgies if they're approved by other churches in our Anglican Communion. So now there exists within the Episcopal Church, the Scottish Episcopal Church, liturgies of marriage that are non-gendered, right? So there are some really interesting canonical questions. And again, I'm not a canonical lawyer, but it makes me very curious how it's going to work.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Joanne. Any other questions or comments for Joanne on anything, or maybe other matters that come to mind from her presentation? Anyone online with any particular question or comment?
I have a question.
Lisa, yeah?
Hi, Joanne. Lisa Payne here at Queen's. I'm just wondering how influential in the upcoming General Synod vote or second reading would these consequences faced by the Episcopal Church and now in Scotland as well have on the voters' decisions? I know it was a factor at the time, or it was talked about at the time of the last reading. And now that it's come again in Scotland, I'm just wondering if there's any rumblings or what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, I think there's two ways to look at it. So I think for some folk, it will be significant because communion for them, with the other churches is something that they hold in high esteem, and that will be a factor in their decision making. And so knowing that the consequences are going to be there will play part, I think, in some people's decision making. It will certainly be an argument that people will make against it. Now, there are other people who will say, well, we won't be alone in facing these consequences. Two other national churches already, have faced the consequences and really been able to keep themselves in pretty good standing within the communion and adjusted their role accordingly. And, we have to be mindful that we're not the only national church engaging in this question. So, by 2019, there may be other churches, who have at least progressed, who have at least entertained a first reading of a change in canon. So you can see how it could play both ways. It can play in one way, well, we don't want to be ousted from the communion. And on the other hand, people might say, well, look, we're not going to be ousted from the communion. We'll just have to make adjustments in the role that we play in the communion. We'll still be at the table, we'll still be in conversation, and we'll still be in communion, with our brothers and sisters. So you can read the situation. That's the thing, most of this is hermeneutics, right? It's about interpretation. And people will read the situation to make it fit their worldview. That's what I think most people do. Like, we know what we want the implications of that to be. So if I want the implications of that to be, we're not going to pass this motion, I'm going to read it that way. If I want the implications of that to be, we should pass this motion, I'm going to read it that way. You see what I mean? It's not really helpful, I know. But these are not, interpretation is a wildly kind of thing, and people will do with it what they will, just as they do with the scriptures and the reports and all the other approaches to this. If you look at any of the studies and information that people have, for the most part, people interpret according to their worldview and their theology. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. That's who we are as humans, and we need to listen, I think, and be respectful to understand, oh, if I believe this and this and this, well, obviously this is the conclusion. Well, that makes sense. I see how you as a person of deep faith can come to that conclusion. Those things make sense, and I respect that, even if it's not, my conclusion and my opinion on that matter. That's sort of my dream, is people will be able to do that. Because I wasn't at last General Synod, Jonathan, I understand from your question, you must have been at there. And my understanding is that people didn't feel heard or respected on, like, wherever they place on the spectrum of opinion on this. And I think that's, something we have to work very hard on.
Yeah, no, I wasn't at General Synod. I wish.
Oh.
I wish I could be at General Synod in 2019, but that's another thing. But I mean, I was struck. One of the things that I was struck in watching the live feed from General Synod, which is where my information is coming from. One of the things that struck me was the number of people who had said, "We just haven't had this conversation yet," and I was sorry about that, because I mean, on one hand, I was sorry that people were coming to General Synod in 2016, supposedly not knowing what they were going to be talking about. I was sorry that in parts of the church there are people who feel like this is a conversation that we as a church have not yet had. And so that was one of the things that I was particularly interested in today, was about this, ideas for pastors and pastoral workers to facilitate debate and discussion. And I'm wondering if, I mean, you mentioned resources and different ways to approach this this discussion and this conversation, and I wondered if are those sorts of things easily accessible, or does it take research and digging to find things like that?
No, actually, I can, the human section, you go on General Synod, put in human sexuality, there's a whole list of resources, and I do even believe the one from Eastern Newfoundland is on it.
Okay.
So it's very, very easy to access. And like I said, the Diocese of Central Newfoundland will have, we're just trying to edit our videos together, and ours should be available very soon.
I might though ask now for a bit of discussion on that. Like, what might parishes and dioceses do to ensure that there's adequate attention to the discussion, and that it won't forever be held up, as often people do, usually as things are moving along? It doesn't take long, you start to get objectors saying they disagree with the process. And it usually is a last-ditch effort to try and object. But it is a reasonable thing to consider the process, especially the consultation process, though there is a phenomenon in organizational theory of consultation fatigue. There's a point after which those who are participating get tired of being consulted if nothing is happening. And it's actually kind of one of the factors that's very relevant in church, circles of all stripes and colors. But anyway, with that said and done, like what from the opinions of participants today and attendees, as well as Joanne, what can be done to make sure that people have ample opportunity to engage? Because efforts are made, resources are developed, but I'm not sure if they get a lot of use. Some who are in ministry in this diocese and others who are attending and participating today might have a comment on the breadth of the usage, or the practicalities, I guess, of when and where and how you bring them forward in a forum to allow people to engage and discuss.
Well, I think there's several things. I mean, one is time, energy, to do it, and a lot of it's apathy. I mean, I know a couple, like just say before General Synod, I wanted to do some sessions here in my own parish, and like I talked to the different lay leaders in my congregations. Nobody wanted it. Like there was apathy, and I think a lot of people think because the national that has changed legally, that is automatically changed in the church. A lot of it's, at least for me, I have found it very difficult to, like I said, Bishop John has mandated that we will do some study on deanery levels and hopefully parish levels. But again, you can prepare studies and you can give them to people, but if they don't show up, or if, all of us in our parishes are very overwhelmed with stuff. It is not, it is not going to happen. And if you choose not to participate, you will go uninformed, unfortunately. And so, you know, it is a real struggle, and I know it's a very big frustration. That for some of us, we feel like we've studied it all to death, and other folks feel that they haven't even begun to talk about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if other people have experiences of trying to get some of these studies on the go.
Yeah, comments or observations from others?
The Eastern Diocese did prepare a study material several years ago. Let me see if I can find it now. I mean, I have it on my computer, but I think it's available online.
2015.
Yeah, so, you know, that's not that long ago.
Yep. So I was part of that. It's Jonathan here. I was part of that group that put that document and that process together. And as about the time that it was released, I had just started into a new parish and was still getting my feet under the table. It took me a while. It was about a year later before I got before we had the wherewithal to make things happen in the parish to have those conversations. There was a limited number of people who showed up to the series of 4 conversations that we had. They were those who were there were interested, enthusiastic. It was good conversations that were there. In some ways, we were sorry that that there weren't more people. There were, but at the same time, I think the way that the conversations played themselves out, if it had been a bigger crowd of people, logistically we wouldn't have it wouldn't have worked quite as well as it did. Yeah.
But it gives a chance, at least, for people to participate, and you get a sense of the breadth of opinions and thoughts, and the way that when people engage, that they become enlightened by one another. Did you find in the sessions that you had, Jonathan, that it was educational and somewhat formative for people in getting new insights, thoughts, ideas, and shifting their positions if they were somewhat firm at the start of the
It's more than a year ago, so I'm trying to remember specific impressions of that. I know that one of the things that was discussed in the sort of the feedback and the sense that we got from those conversations, a lot of people were really excited about the opportunity to talk about things theologically, which I don't think that we, as a general rule, we're not really good about doing that in the church, and that. I mean, there were people who were part of those conversations who said, "What are we going to talk about next? What can we, what can we do more?" There's maybe we don't need to talk more about this, but maybe we need to talk about other things and look at it with those same sort of theological approach and that sort of thing.
Great. Any other comments or observations? Anyone online with anything to add? Love to hear you. Don't be shy. Okay, any last words from you then, Joanne?
No, I mean, like I said, I thought after the events of the primates meeting that I would change my approach to teaching this. And there's lots and lots and lots of information and lots of ways to approach it. You know, I hope you recognize that this discussion, you know, really touches on a wide variety of things, not just you know, like it is a very theological question. It's a very biblical question. It's a very ecclesiological question, and you know, we need to look at it from all those aspects when we're discussing it. It has implications.
Yeah, and the session, it was an excellent session, Joanne, as your presentations are, but you really brought together, you know, matters that are of great relevance to the subject and to that revision of the canon, but also help understand how and why people have been able to make the moves they have made, because I know that's a matter of concern to some, how and why some dioceses and what have you have introduced changes that seem at the start of it were agreed that would be done through the national church. So it's interesting and helpful to understand. And I think sometimes when we understand why people make the moves they do and how they are reasoning it out, whether you'd agree with it or not, sometimes that can be helpful to unity and to reconciliation. And that's always a good thing. So thank you, Joanne, for
You're welcome.
your presentation today. And as I said before, thank you again for all you do with us and for us at Queen's. And I love having you participate. Joanne, of course, an adjunct member of faculty with Queen's College. And thank you for those who have attended here today and online. Great opportunity. Spread the word to others that this will be available on our website at the YouTube channel that we have posted there. And so thank you and best of luck. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.